Muchas gracias a todos por haberse unido a esta charla. Vamos a comenzar en unos 2 minutos. Entonces, gracias por su paciencia y gracias de nuevo por estar aquí. And thank you to everyone for joining this conversation. We're going to start in about 2 minutes here. So thanks for your patience and thanks for being here. Bueno, antes de comenzar, les quiero recordar que la charla de hoy será en inglés, pero si prefieren escucharla en español y están con nosotros en Zoom, pueden habilitar la opción para interpretación simultánea en la parte inferior de sus pantallas. Van a ver como un dibujito de un mundo y ahí pueden seleccionar la opción para español. Y si están con nosotros en redes sociales, también se pueden unir al Zoom para escuchar la interpretación simultánea al español. So thank you all so much for joining us in today's conversation, which is brought to you by Symbiosis. Symbiosis is a journalism training program and a space for collaboration, professional development, and on-the-ground reporting directed at emerging journalists in the Americas. Together, Gato Pardo's editorial and creative team and the faculty at Arizona State University's Walter Cronkite School of Journalism and Mass Communication have developed an annual program made up of public conversations, specialized workshops, and on-site residencies. By helping emerging journalists develop the skills they need to tell our region's most urgent stories, the program seeks to deepen understanding of shared challenges related to the environment, racial equity, human rights, democracy, and social justice. My name is Mia Armstrong, and I'm one of the collaborators behind Symbiosis. I work at Arizona State University on projects with Mexican partners, including Gato Pardo, and I'm a journalist by trade and a graduate of the Cronkite School. In today's conversation, we'll be discussing how journalists can ethically cover violence, conveying its depth, impact, and context without falling into sensationalism, while always centering the people most affected by that violence. To do so, we're lucky to be joined by Kathy Corcoran. Kathy is the co-director of Cronkite Noticias and former Mexico and Central America bureau chief for the Associated Press. Under Kathy's leadership, the AP broke major stories, including extrajudicial killings by the Mexican army and a DEA drug raid that mistakenly targeted civilians in Honduras. She first joined the news organization as an editor on the Latin America desk after stints at the San Jose Mercury News, the Denver Post, and the San Francisco Chronicle. She's a former fellow at the Alicia Patterson Foundation and at the Kellogg Institute for International Studies at the University of Notre Dame, as well as the co-founder of Quinto Elemento Lab's Master Lab. Kathy is the author of the forthcoming book, In the Mouth of the Wolf, A Murder, a Cover-Up, and the True Cost of Silencing the Press, which chronicles the murder of journalists in Veracruz, Mexico, and the resulting effects on free expression and democracy. Kathy, thank you so much for being here with us today.
Thank you so much for inviting me.
So I'd like to start by asking you to tell us a little bit about our book. Take us back to 2012 when you started covering the story and kind of take us through how your reporting on the story that later became your book evolved into what it is now.
Well, as you mentioned, Regina Martinez was killed in 2012. And by the time she was killed, there had been many journalists killed in Mexico, and I was the bureau chief. And so I was living that story on 2 levels. First of all, it was a big story that we were covering and writing about, but also it affected the security of our correspondents, and I was responsible for their security. And so I was, like, as I said, I was dealing with this issue on 2 levels. And one of the things about these early killings, things have changed quite a bit in Mexico in the last 10 years in this regard, but in these early killings, the governments would just dismiss them as corrupt journalists. And there were a lot of corrupt journalists. There still are, but things have changed. And they would say, oh, well, they were working for the narcos, they were doing this, they were that. And they would say that basically they were killed because they were working for the dark side and they weren't true journalists. And the thing is, we had no way of knowing because they never did any investigations, any real honest investigations. And so it was kind of a mantra, and even journalists would repeat that to each other. Oh, well, they're not real journalists. They're not real journalists. And then when this happened to Regina, there was absolutely no question that she was a real journalist. And the reason that I knew that personally is because she had worked for a time as a collaborator for the Associated Press in Veracruz. And she predated my time as bureau chief. But one day I was really in need of some help in Veracruz, and all of my colleagues at the AP said, she's really good, give her a try. And we had to vet people very carefully, the people who worked for us in the provinces, because of that, because of the corruption. And so I knew that she had a very high regard at the AP, and I called her up and asked her if she could help us out on a story. And she said no, she was busy because she was working full-time for Proceso then. And that was the extent of our interaction. I really didn't think anything about it. And then about 6 months later, I read that she had been murdered. And so in that particular case, I knew that it was to silence a journalist. You couldn't argue on any level that she was corrupt or involved with the wrong people. So that became, in a very murky situation, a clear-cut case to examine.
And so take us through, so once you decide that you're going to report on Regina's story, kind of take us through that journey. You mentioned, Regina was murdered in 2012. We're almost, 10 years later, and you've just wrapped up your book. So kind of take us through, what was it like to start reporting on that story, and how did your reporting progress over the subsequent years?
Well, the situation in Veracruz at the time was extremely tense. It was very difficult to get anybody to talk about these cases or any of the atrocities that were happening at the time because of narco violence. And every time we sent a team out, if something happened, nobody would talk to them. And even when these journalists were killed and you would send a team out, nobody, even the newspapers, even the news media wouldn't talk to us about what was going on, about these attacks against their own people. Everyone was so afraid. And so, and I was bureau chief, so I basically had a 24/7 job. And so I didn't really have the capacity to really dig into that case, but it just stayed in the back of my mind. And I just always thought, when I do have the time, I'm going to return and dig into that case. And in that sense, the passage of time helped, because as there was more distance from the event, more people were willing to talk, except that it still was extremely difficult. And even to this day, people will not talk about that case. So to me, the time passage was an advantage, because if I had tried to do it right after it happened, it would have been extremely difficult and would have been extremely dangerous. And so, I stepped down from being bureau chief in 2015, so 3 years later. So I really didn't start to look at it in earnest until I was no longer bureau chief.
And I know to reconstruct Regina's life and then the circumstances that led up to her death, you spent a lot of time around colleagues, friends, family. Just walk us through kind of how you went about putting those pieces together and trying to reconstruct this narrative of her life and the circumstances that led to her death.
Well, again, it was extremely difficult because number one, people didn't want to talk. Her family never did want to talk ever. Um, and because she was a very private person, she was very discreet and had a very close circle around her, mainly for her own security. And there were a lot of things about her that people didn't know. And I basically had a stroke of good luck that one of our collaborators in Veracruz was a close friend of hers, and he was working for the AP in Veracruz, and I hired him just purely out of coincidence. He was a good friend of hers, and he and I developed a very strong relationship as colleagues and as journalists. And I have, very high respect for his journalism. And so because we knew each other, he trusted me to start talking about it. But even then, it was very difficult. And I really wanted to write about the real person. It's obviously very difficult when the person isn't there. And everybody has a different impression or idea or different things to say. But I wanted to write about the real person and not the mythical character that she became, because her murder was very widely covered, widely known. There have been many investigations into it. And with that time, this sort of mythology developed around her, and this kind of lionization of her as a reporter. And I wanted to write about the real person because I knew from the people who knew her that she would absolutely hate the publicity. She was very much against protagonismo, and she was basically, for her, she was a very classic journalist. Like, for her, it was about the story. It was never about her. And so when there were demonstrations or memorials or various events going around her death, her closest friends would just say to me, she would hate this. And so so that's why I was after the real person.
Yeah, and so I think, one of the questions that I wanted to ask you was what sort of weight or responsibility you felt toward Regina in trying to reconstruct her story and reconstruct her life. And it sounds like, one of the things is trying to portray her as she was, not as she became, after her death and this kind of resulting media coverage. So what other sorts of weight or responsibility did you feel toward her and in telling her story?
Well, I kind of felt it was interesting because I felt like she was kind of playing a cat and mouse game with me because it was so difficult to know who she really was. And also I kind of felt like maybe she didn't want me doing this because of what people told me. But I thought that I thought the story was so important in a wider context. But again, I didn't want to distort her or lose her in trying to tell this wider story. And so, after a while, I spent years after years of hearing people say different things. You kind of just cross-reference and you decide, I've heard this one thing from so many people, who didn't, maybe hadn't spoken to each other, or didn't know each other. I just kind of constructed her from there.
Yeah, and so as you mentioned, you have this individual story, which is Regina's story, and then you have this larger story of the epidemic of violence against journalists in Mexico. And so, talk a little bit about the larger story that you want to tell with this book and with your reporting.
Well, I started out on this subject because I was watching this happen, and it's still happening. Nothing has changed. And I was pretty astonished at the level of assassinations, the number of assassinations year after year. And obviously there was a world that was paying attention to this in terms of NGOs and free press organizations, et cetera. But I just felt like the wider world had no idea. They didn't really care. And I wanted to show a wider audience what was happening in Mexico. That was my first motivation. My next motivation was I wanted to portray these journalists, and in particular her, as human beings, because when a journalist is killed, the coverage is almost entirely in the context of an attack on freedom of expression or the free press or democracy, and there's rarely a look at the person as a human being and the people around them and the impact that these kinds of acts have on so many people. And I really wanted to show that in terms of like the human impact, the coverage impact, the just the wide circle, how this one act just affects this wide circle in terms of people's emotions and how they do their work and how they think, and it's, to me, in reporting that part of it, it was just impactful. It was greater than I even expected. And I wanted to show that impact, just how immense it is and how fierce it is, and how that just the fear and the terrorism that people have to live with. And then finally, I wanted to show people why, if you're an average person, why you should care if a journalist is assassinated or a journalist is silenced. And I recently wrote a column about that for the Washington Post, where I say the answer is quite simple. When a journalist is attacked or killed, they are not the ultimate target. The ultimate target is you. They are the people behind these acts are silencing the journalists because they want to control what you know, and ultimately they want to control you. And so I just wanted to get that message out there, because I really don't think it was getting out there. I think it was like, oh, well, that's sort of an occupational hazard, an internal thing, and we all hate the media anyway. The media is sensationalist, and all the things that people say. And I just wanted them to see that the impact is ultimately on them.
Yeah, I think that's so important. And I was struck by a line in that Washington Post column that you mentioned. You write, one time in my long journalism career, I proposed doing an in-depth story on a reporter who had been murdered in Mexico. The editor rejected the pitch, saying, quote, "No one cares about what happens to journalists except other journalists. Journalists have been drilled with the notion that they should never become the story. As a result, we are the worst at handling situations where we do, much like the adage that doctors make the worst patients." So I'd like for you to talk a little bit more about that, and how do you think that we can, as journalists, kind of help the public understand that mission, that idea that you just mentioned, which is that when there's attack on a journalist, there's an attack on us all. How might we rethink the way that we approach coverage of these events?
Well, I think, first of all, as journalists, the only thing we can do is tell stories. Like, there's a difference between what we do and advocacy. And there are many groups, press groups, that are doing the advocacy, and that is very helpful. But I think for us, we need to just tell stories. And this is a story that I chose to tell because it has all these elements in it. And even as we speak, I'm thinking of another story to tell that will show this exact same thing. Like, what is the void? What is missing when you kill a journalist for the average person, for the regular citizen? And so those are just the kinds of stories that I would like to tell. But I'm a journalist and I'm telling stories. Number one. Number two, I think when media organizations become the target of an attack or harassment. And maybe this has changed a little bit too from when I was bureau chief, but I think that we need to be transparent. What we do is we act like other sources we try to cover when something terrible happens, and we shut down and we say, oh, well, we can't talk about that, or we can't give any details, and I think it should be just the opposite. I think that we should behave like we want our sources to behave, and that is to be honest and to be transparent and to say, this is what happened, this is what we know, this is what we don't know. This is, what we think the impact is, and again, the top editors, the publishers, they can come out and say, this is an attack on our ability to do our jobs, et cetera, et cetera. And when I was in Mexico, that was not happening. As I mentioned, there was just a complete shutdown on the part of these media organizations who were attacked. Nobody would talk. And I think in the United States, that's kind of a reaction too, although fortunately we don't have that many attacks. I do think, and we've had some really terrible ones, where I do think the leaders of those organizations were more transparent about what was going on. But I think traditionally we sort of shut down, like, in a way that we don't want our sources doing, but we do it ourselves. And so I think that we just need to be more open about these kinds of attacks. I think that gives you power. I think the silence and the closing in is actually, it lets the bad guys win.
Yeah, I think that's so important in terms of thinking about transparency from an inside out model. And I want to ask, because you mentioned the understandable fear among many of your sources or folks in general in Veracruz in the wake of Regina's murder. So while you were covering Regina's story, did you ever feel like you or others that you worked with, sources, collaborators, were in danger because of your reporting on the story?
Well, that is like job number one when you're doing a story like this, is to make sure or do everything in your power so that doesn't happen. And when you were talking about covering violence, and you raised a really important point about not re-traumatizing victims of violence, but also before you even do that, you have to consider the security of your sources in a situation like Mexico and in many, many places in the world right now. And so you can't just like run in and chopper in and knock on doors and like you would normally do on a story. You have to be very careful about how you approach people and when you approach people, and how you do it, so that you can, so that you don't put your sources in danger. And that can be a very tricky thing, but it's something that I thought about all the time during the entire project.
Yeah, no, I think that's really important. And I think, I wonder if you have any specific tools or specific questions that young journalists or other folks should be asking themselves when they're doing this sort of coverage, in terms of thinking about self-protection and also the protection of their sources. Like what are, I know it's hard, we can't necessarily be prescriptive about this of here's the checklist to follow, but are there any kind of important things that you would highlight for folks?
Well, for example, how you conduct your work yourself. Like everyone, I think people who aren't journalists think that we go into these areas with like bodyguards and bulletproof vehicles. That's stuff that does happen in war zones. But in these unofficial war zones, the way to approach it is you want to be under the radar as much as possible. You just want to blend in with the crowd. You don't want to stand out in any way. And so I had a whole regimen that I would do to do that. Like you ride buses and you take taxis and you go around like a regular person. I did not ever register or buy tickets under my real name, like bus tickets. Obviously, if you're flying, you have to, but bus tickets, hotels, I never registered under my real name. Obviously, as a reporter, I always gave people my real name when I was reporting, because that's, you know, paramount in ethics. But when I was just traveling, I was very under the radar. I didn't use my real name, and I carried big wads of cash because I thought if somebody really wanted to track me, I didn't want them to be able to track me via credit card purchases or ATM withdrawals or things like that. And so those are kind of my basic tools. I also had people inside Veracruz and people outside Veracruz who were monitoring me, and I would check in with them. And so there are ways, first of all, to keep yourself out of sight and, you know, have a backup. And then with sources, it takes a lot of legwork to figure out who is going to be a friendly source and who is not. And so obviously you're going to go to the friendly sources first, and you're going to go to the people who are not going to tell other people what you're doing, which is why you have to find the most reliable sources first, because you don't want certain people to know right away what you're doing, because then you have freedom. If you let certain people know, then all of a sudden doors will shut, sources will shut down. And so you have to be very calculating about who you approach and when.
And how I understand, you know, again, it's a question that's maybe hard to be prescriptive about, but how might you know which sources are the ones to trust, or which are the friendly sources to start with? How might, you know, young reporters think about that?
Well, it starts like any other, when you're building sources on any kind of subject or beat or story, is, you know, you have, like I said, I had a person who I worked with who I trusted very much, who started with, you know, telling me who were the right people to talk to. And then from there, I just had to branch out. And the thing that was really difficult was this was another way to protect my sources. I didn't tell anybody who I was talking to. Like, not anybody. There was a close-knit, you'll see in the book, a close-knit group of people who I relied on heavily. And they all knew that I was talking to all of them. But even outside of that group, they didn't know who I was talking to. And I really had to keep people's confidence. And it was very difficult for the reporting, because I couldn't cross-reference things like you normally do as a reporter with names. Like, you know, you talk to somebody on the record and you go to another person and say, well, so-and-so said this, what do you think? And they'll go, oh yeah, well, that person would know, you know, I would go with what they say, you know, that kind of thing. And I couldn't do that at all, because I didn't want anybody to know who I was talking to.
Yeah, no, that's incredibly challenging. I just want to remind people who are joining us here on Zoom, if you have questions for Kathy, you can put them in the Q&A box. We'd love to get questions from the audience in a couple of minutes here. But Kathy, I want to kind of continue this conversation about sources, because you were interviewing sources who might be very hesitant to talk, afraid to talk for understandable reasons, and or B, sources who were very traumatized by the event. And so when you were doing the interviews, sitting down to do interviews, how do you conduct interviews with people who or maybe very hesitant or fearful, or B, you know, who may be very traumatized, and you're trying to conduct an interview in a way that avoids re-traumatizing those individuals?
Well, I think, and this, I would follow this in any kind of covering victims of violence, is first of all, you really only want to talk to the people who are willing to talk. You never want to pressure or force anyone who's been traumatized. And some people, when they are traumatized, they do want to talk. So I start with the people who do want to talk. And I have to say that probably the biggest thing you need to do with these kinds of interviews is you need to be, well, first of all, I think the most important thing a journalist has is integrity. And so you have to convey that you are a person who is going to, respect their limitations and use their information in a fair way and not in an exploitive or sensational way. So you need to establish your integrity, and you need to be a human being. For example, when I was a younger reporter, I always felt this pressure, like if somebody gave me some really good material, it's like, oh my God, I got to get that in the story, and then they'd say, well, you can't write that, or, and I would just, be devastated. And now as an older reporter, I know that there's always more material. You don't have to pressure somebody ever to give you something. And again, I'm speaking in the context of a victim of violence, to give you something that they don't want to give. I mean, and sometimes this happened to me many times when people would say they do want to talk, and we would start talking, and I could tell that they were just, they were breaking down. They were having an episode of PTSD. And so as the journalist, you need to, like I said, in those cases, you need to be a human being, or for me anyway. And there was a case, just for an example, and this is in the book, there was a case where I had some court documents, and all the names were redacted because it was a public version of the court documents. And I knew a person very close to the case who could tell me who those people were just by reading the court documents. They would know the names, and then I would have the names so I could go knock on their doors. And so I asked this person if they would do that for me, and they're like, sure. And we sat down and started going through the court documents, and just reading the court documents had a terrible effect on this person. And it wasn't anticipated by me, and it wasn't anticipated by him either. And so we just shut it down. And I said, not going to get that information that way. We stopped, and I never ever asked him to do that again. And so you just kind of have to measure as you go how people are.
No, I mean, it's such a professional responsibility to do that, and to be constantly assessing and reassessing. We have a question here from Jonathan, and he says, hola, la policía, ¿qué tan confiable puede ser como fuente? Por ejemplo, en la selva generan una desconfianza tremenda. So I think this is an important question that I wanted to ask too. What do you do when you might have official sources like the police whose narratives contradict, for example, eyewitnesses or family members or colleagues of victims? What do you do in those cases?
Well, in a lot of places, as Jonathan says, the police are not, the police are co-opted or corrupt, and that's your basic assumption. Like, I almost never went to the police for sources unless I knew that it was a person, one individual who was willing to go against the grain, or had a story to tell, or had some information to share. But I never officially went to police looking for information. In Mexico, official information is often wrong. And And so you have to treat it as such. You have to look at it and see if it makes sense. And if you're able to, you go out and you find your own version. A lot of times it's too dangerous to do that, but we did do that at the Associated Press. When we could, we would go out and we would create our, we would report the situation. We would not go with what the officials were saying. We would go out to the scene and we would look at the evidence and we would interview the people. And we often found, like so many times, that the story was different from what the official version was. And of course, the most famous case of all is the 43 teacher students who disappeared. The quote official story on that from the very beginning was just one lie on top of the other. And that's unfortunately pretty common there. And so, yeah, it makes the reporting very complicated.
Yeah, no, and it's just, it's just more proof of how necessary it is to have the investment of time and resources so that reporters can go out and do that verification. There's another question here from John, and he says, there's been a lot of attention on the killing of journalists in Mexico this year. Do you think the situation is getting worse, or is the US media just noticing it now?
I think probably the latter. Well, I think probably both. I mean, it is getting worse as time goes on. And I think because it's getting worse, it's garnering more attention outside of Mexico. But it's just astonishing. It just continues to be astonishing to me how these killings continue and just nothing is done, like nothing. And I guess I think that in the United States now, with these, the official attitude toward the news media has really changed quite a bit in the last few years. And this idea of we're all fake news and we're all this and we're all that. I think that journalists in the United States now, and there are attacks on journalists now in the United States, not anything like Mexico, but we've seen them, during protests and during the insurrection, camera equipment being broken. There was a photographer thrown over a wall at the Capitol. And so I think that there's maybe a sensibility now among US journalists, more so than before, that maybe makes them a little more interested or open to what's happening to journalists in other countries.
Yeah, and I want to zoom out a little bit and talk a little bit about coverage of violent acts more generally. We've been talking kind of about some specific examples, but I think one of the risks of a lot of this coverage is sometimes it can fall into sensationalism when it's not done well. I think sometimes there's this appetite for true crime type stories that maybe stray away from the purpose of what a lot of these stories should be. So how do you think about how journalists can, in their coverage of violent acts, stray away from this territory where it might be more sensationalizing of violence and crime?
Well, I think, as journalists, whatever we're doing, we always start with two questions. One is, what is the story? And the second question is, why does it matter? And I think just applying those two basic questions to any act of violence, you have to think about the context and what is the best way to tell this? What is the story I'm trying to tell? And what is the best way to tell it? And I think if you focus on those two questions, it keeps you away from violence for violence sake, because you have to think about, well, if I'm going to portray something particularly violent or gory, why am I doing it? What does it say? What story am I trying to tell? As opposed to, wow, look at this. Can you believe this? And I think there was a really interesting example most recently and the war in Ukraine of the New York Times photographer Lindsay Addario, who took a picture of a dead family right after they'd been shelled. And the conversations with her about that photo were so interesting to me, because one of the interviewers asked her, what did you want to tell with this story, or with this photograph? What were you trying to tell? And she said, I was documenting a war crime, like, period. She said, the information coming out of Russia is that they're not targeting civilians, and we need to be there on the ground to tell the truth that they are. She personally visually saw this shelling of civilians. And that photograph had a lot of ethical issues. And she said she even felt bad taking the photograph, but later she was glad that her editors at the New York Times decided to publish it. The father / husband of that family found out his family was dead by looking at that photograph. And so there were a lot of ethical implications, but in her mind, she was very clear about what the story, this is the story, and this is why I made this photo and why I wanted it published. And listening to that, I would say I completely agree with that thought process. So I think that there are many ways to convey the impact or the issue or the importance of a violent act, also that would not be showing a dead family. But, like, for example, when Lourdes Maldonado, the journalist in Tijuana, was killed, there was a photograph that went completely viral, and it was of her dog sitting on the doorstep of her house behind the yellow caution tape, like just hanging out waiting for her to come home. And that photo went everywhere, and there was nothing violent in the depiction at all, but it had such the sensation of the loss of this person. And to me, that was the best way to convey that, with a photograph that had, nothing violent in it at all. So, as I said, you have to think about the context, but you have to think about, what is the story and why do I want to tell it this way?
No, I think that's so important. And I think with images, it's, there are so many examples of this gray space. And I think returning to this question that you mentioned of, what is the purpose? Well, how am I bearing witness? What do I want to bear witness to? I think we just have to return to that question. And I'd like to read here, if I can, a fragment of a story that you edited for the Associated Press in 2009, which I think is a good way, a good lens through which to look at some of these issues that we're discussing. And this was a profile of a morgue in Ciudad Juarez, which was written by the reporter Julie Watson. So Julie writes, "Death froze his exhausted face. The attackers lashed or punctured nearly every part of his body. They then cut off the dead man's head, wrapped it in a plastic grocery bag, and dumped it with his body between two tractor trailers on a city street. As with most murders in Ciudad Juarez, police found no witnesses, no weapons. Only the battered corpse on the steel coroner's table carries clues to who he was and how he died. Every organ speaks," says Dr. Maria Concepcion Molina, who gently removes packing tape from the head of her third decapitated victim in a week. "The dead man's slack mouth and eyes seem to pray for relief." So when I read this story, first I was really struck by the narrative description of this, horrific violence that this individual was suffering, but also that the city was suffering. But I found it to also be a really unique lens to portray kind of the collective impact of an individual tragedy, right? There's an individual tragedy, which is this person's death, but then there's also this collective impact, which is the epidemic of violence, and you're seeing it through the lens of the people who are working in the morgue, who see this day in and day out. So and we started the conversation actually by talking a little bit about this in your coverage of Regina's story, right? There's the individual tragedy of the loss of her life. And then there's this collective tragedy of the larger epidemic of violence against journalists. And so I wanted to ask you if you could walk us through, as an editor, when you're working with a reporter to develop stories on violence, how do you think about these issues as you're developing the story? And then when you have the draft on your desk, how do you kind of balance and contextualize individual tragedies and then what they might represent in the collective?
Well, again, I always go back to context. And the context for that story in 2009 was very different than if a reporter came to me today and said they wanted to tell that story. I would say no. Like, why? What's the purpose? But if you look at 2009, violence was exploding, and I mean exploding in Mexico, particularly in Ciudad Juarez, in a way that no one had ever seen before. And that was news. And it was having an impact on so many facets of life and society. We were always trying to show that. Like, how is this violence, which is just supposedly between bad guys? And actually the president at the time sort of cast that way. Oh, they're just bad guys, But we were like, no, this isn't impacting the entire society. And so how do we tell that story? Especially when, again, the official story is, no, it's not. If you're not if you're not going andando en malos pasos, you're going to be fine. And that just plain wasn't true. And so, so we had heard, and all the things that you're hearing with this huge explosion of violence, that the morgues were overwhelmed. But we could not, a lot of journalists were trying to get into morgues. We could not get anyone to confirm that. And Julie Watson, who still works for the Associated Press, she's a fabulous reporter. She was able to get into a morgue in Ciudad Juarez. And I was her direct editor on that story. And so again, she was in Juarez writing about the violence. We said, let's try to get into a morgue. We didn't know if we were going to or not. And once she was inside, the idea was just collect everything. Just get everything that you have, that you see, that you can. And she, first of all, we confirmed with that story that the morgues were overwhelmed. And the other thing that story did was to confirm the sort of the viciousness, the inhumanity of what was happening to these people. And they were mostly young men. And the idea, there were details in there that I think were very significant in terms of the idea that families wouldn't come get the bodies because they were scared. That in the morgues, they would show the families' clothing because the bodies were in such terrible shape, to identify them by their clothing. And that the coroner said, we show them the clothing and they say, yeah, that was theirs, but that's not him. And so there was like this story in there of not only the inhumanity that was occurring in these cartel wars, but the impact it was having on the families and the workers in the morgue. They were completely overwhelmed. And there were, now that story's how many years old now? And there have been many stories of like bodies in trailers and all kinds of things going on in Mexico, which is like why now it's not a story anymore. I mean, it's like, but at that time, that view had never been reported. And so as the editor, I wanted as much detail in that story as possible. But I was the on the ground editor working directly with Julie. And that story did require my editors that I reported to read the story and they said to us, you got to take some of this stuff out. And and that I think was important, because I needed on something like that, because you really can cross the line. You want other eyes on it, and you want other people saying, and somebody who's not as close to the story as you are saying, no, we got to take that out. And you know, me as an editor, I'm looking for that guidance on one hand. On another hand, if there is a significant detail that I think needs to be in there and another editor wants to get out, then I make my case for that. And I say, no, this is important. And again, you have to justify it, because what does it say about the story? Why is this important to the story? Not, we've got to show people how gory this is. It's like, why is this important to the story? And I was thankful that I had other eyes saying, no, this is not important to the story, we're taking it out. But then again, if somebody wanted to take something out, I had to explain why I thought it was important. And so that story is entirely about the context of the drug violence in that particular year and that particular moment.
Yeah. Yeah. And so I think this relates to, and I'd like to close this out with this question, but we got a question from Vivette, who asks, narratively, how do you write in order to avoid sensationalism? Any specific tips? And I mean, it sounds like one of the things that you're just talking about is kind of going through each detail and asking the question of why does this need to be there? What does this say about the story? But do you have any other specific tips that people might consider as they set out to write these stories?
Yes. So yeah, you always have to know why. You have to know what the story is and what does it mean. And then that way you don't veer into crossing lines, I would say. Another thing that I do is, especially if I'm working with people who've been traumatized by violence, and there's this thing in journalism where they say, well, you're not supposed to let your sources read your story, and you're not supposed to let your sources edit your story. And that's absolutely true. I agree with that 100%. But what I do with victims of violence is I don't let them read it, but I go over the material that I'm using from the interview. And that does two things for me. First of all, it's a fact-checking thing. I can make sure that everything I have is correct. And I can let this person know who's chosen to tell this story, what part of the story is going to be public ahead of time, because it's very jarring to read about yourself, especially with a traumatic incident, or see yourself on, in a news report. And so for me, it's a way to, first of all, fact check, but in another way to sort of give the person a heads up so that it's not as jarring when they actually see it, because they already know what's going to be there. And I just find that it's a really good way to, again, keep yourself from crossing the line. And also, a lot of times when you're reporting and there's something sensitive about somebody's life, there are really small details that mean absolutely nothing to you that you put in there and mean a lot to them. And they will say, can you please not say that? Like, I had that in my book where people would say, I don't care what you write about me, but you mentioned a family member, please take them out. And so, and as long as that, I mean, again, doing that doesn't take away from the story, but it saves some people some trauma. And so, or security, or things like that. And so I think when you're writing about these subjects, you have to have that extra sensibility of, how is this going to be when it gets published? And again, not to let them edit you or determine what you write, not in any way at all. I do this as a courtesy. And I see a lot of things that people point out that to me is like, oh, I have no trouble taking that out at all. I didn't even notice it, but it's a big deal to them. And so I just feel like as I said, there's another level of consideration and sensibility when you're writing about real people who've been through these kinds of things.
Yeah, and I mean, I think hearing you speak, it's about due diligence. It's about relationship building. It's about, you know, giving people autonomy in the process, and not just seeing the source reporter relationship as a purely kind of extractive, I'm going to extract information for you, and then, you know, we part ways for forever. And so I think kind of thinking about it as a relationship seems really important.
And just always think about what's the story? Why do I need this? Why do I want this? What am I trying to show?
Yeah.
Why is it important?
Yeah. Well, I think we're going to have to close now, but I think it's really, it's a good question to close on, because I think that's the question that has really been underlying this entire conversation. So thank you so much, Kathy, for taking the time to share your reporting with us, to share these tips with us. I think it's been incredibly helpful for me, and I think to many folks in the audience as well. And thank you, everyone in the audience, for joining us in today's conversation, which is a part of Symbiosis, a journalism training program developed by Gato Pardo and Arizona State University's Walter Cronkite School of Journalism and Mass Communication. Symbiosis includes public chats like this one, as well as interactive workshops and on-site journalism residencies. And applications are currently open for our residency program, which is hosted by Gato Pardo and will be held in the Yucatan Peninsula this summer. More information can be found on our website, which is academiagatopardo.com/symbiosis. And the applications for the residencies are due before April 15th. So if you're interested in participating, be sure to send your applications to Gato Pardo. And just kind of as a final reminder, we'll have another conversation like this one that we had with Kathy next Thursday at 7 p.m. with Susan Goldberg. She's a vice dean at the Cronkite School and the former editor-in-chief of National Geographic, and she'll be discussing how to cover the climate crisis. So this is part of a series of conversations in Symbiosis that we hope will help folks have important conversations about journalistic tradecraft. So until next time, take care, and thank you so much, Kathy.
Thank you so much for having me. This was a very interesting conversation for me as well.
Okay, great. Well, take care. Bye-bye.